Have you ever noticed that many people seem to think that both sides are bad is the worst, most evil thing anyone can say? The two sides can only ever be irreconcilably different, moving in opposite directions, away from each other. But the funny thing is, both sides are bad. And the worse they get, the further they go, the closer they seem to be to one another. That's called Horseshoe Theory, and partisans hate it. Left or right, they will tell you they are nothing like the other side. But they are. They're very much like the other side. And if you can stay with me for about the length of a 90s rom-com, I'll show you how. But first, allow me to introduce myself. Hey, get it? I'm Peter Coffin, and as you can see, I've switched careers. I'm now a 40-year-old horse girl, and let me tell you, I am making crazy money on the racetrack. Not because I'm a good jockey, mind you, I am so bad at this. I have no prior experience. I didn't train. I just egotistically said I could do that and started doing it. And I can't. I'm not good at it. So I had a better idea. One so good it made my hair part down the middle like the cartoon Grinch when I thought of it. I started betting against myself. Don't worry, I am not cheating. I am actually trying as hard as I can to win. Betting against myself is just realistic. But obviously today, I am here for a different kind of race, Horseshoe Theory. Man, that was a labored seg. You see why I'm running this jockey scheme? Horseshoe Theory has been galloping around the political discourse for a while now, and like I said, posits the far left and far right bend towards each other. If you search on YouTube, you'll find tons of people debunking it, but I think the way that everyone approaches the topic has totally failed to acknowledge something important. Very important. Let me put it this way. Ads for Burger King or McDonald's always make the food look great, right? And you can easily tell the difference between BK and Mickey D's just by looking at them. They are aesthetically very different in the ads, but materially speaking, they both make you shit your brains out. So in the way it truly matters, well, both sides are bad. And they keep getting worse, more and more alike as well. Yet everyone keeps coming back. Why is that? But enough horsing around, let's get this race started. Horseshoe Theory is right, but not how you think.
I'm just a bachelor. I'm looking for a partner, someone who knows how to ride without even falling off. Gotta be compatible. That takes me to my limit. Girl, when I break you off, I promise that you won't wanna get off. If you're horny, let's do it. Riding my pony, my saddle's waiting. Come and jump on it. If you're horny, let's do it. Riding my pony, my saddle's waiting. Come and jump on it.
Horseshoe Theory is an idea that French philosopher Jean-Pierre Fay proposed in his 2002 book, The Century of Ideologies. It suggests that the ends of the political spectrum, the far left and far right, are more similar to each other than to the center. The theory critiques the traditional straight-line representation of the political spectrum and suggests a horseshoe shape instead, due to its ends getting closer to each other. As one might expect, Horseshoe Theory has plenty of critics. They argue that their underlying ideological beliefs and goals differ vastly. But Fay asserts that both extremes exhibit authoritarian tendencies, and he conflates Stalin's communist Russia with Hitler's Nazi Germany. The theory's critics generally see this as an oversimplification that doesn't fully capture the ideological differences between left and right.
So I have a pretty different critique. It'd be Pretty boring if I didn't, though, right? To get to it, though, we need to understand the basis where horseshoe theory is working from. So, why do we contrast political thought by left and right? Why is it all blue and red? Pepsi and Coke, Visa and MasterCard, Nacho Cheese Doritos and Cool Ranch Doritos. It's like we're stuck in a never-ending Super Bowl commercial, just with less believable lies.
The origins of the left-right dichotomy go back to the French Revolution, but this is more often discussed as a simple starting point and a representation of different sets of abstract ideological principles rather than a basis for them. In Italian political scientist Norberto Bobbio's 1994 book, Left and Right, The Significance of a Political Distinction, he characterizes the dichotomy as such.
Left and right are two antithetical terms that for more than 2 centuries have been used habitually to signify the contrast between the ideologies and the movements which divide the world of political thought and action. The opposition between left and right represents a typically dyadic way of thinking. In sociology, it is society, community. In the economics, it is a market, planned. In law, public, private. In aesthetics, classical and romantic. And in philosophy, transcendent, immanent. Left and right is not the only distinction in the political sphere, but it is encountered everywhere.
Bobbio's work is pretty reflective of mainstream opinions on what left and right mean. On the left is progress, revolution, egalitarianism, while on the right is regression, conservatism, and authoritarianism. This way of viewing things associates the ends of the spectrum with different ideals, similar to the spectrum between, Fruit Loops and Cocoa Krispies. These two methods of sugar delivery sure do taste different.
This frames the political landscape as a battle between opposing principles, where one side represents progress or advancement, and the other represents a desire to either maintain the status quo or revert to past norms. The issue is that terms like progress, advancement, regression, and reaction are subjective. What one person or group considers progress might be seen as regression by another, depending on their interests and perspectives. Yes, opposing perspectives cause conflict. However, it's important to understand that ideology often detaches perspective from a person or group's material interests. And what can we call leftism and rightism if not ideologies or groups of ideologies? Conflicts that arise are over abstractions and hypotheticals. It's akin to fandom, where arguments revolve around what is considered canon. Through these conflicts, the focus becomes more about signaling allegiance to a particular ideological tribe than material interests.
Wait a second, signaling? Signifying an alliance to a particular ideology? Are we talking about virtue signaling? Is that really what idealist political activism is? No wonder people on the left and right are always accusing each other of doing this. It's because they're doing it. All of them. And none of them think they're doing it. They all think they're just being correct about things, and their enemies are the virtue signalers. Which is why I support a woman's right to choose. Because choosy moms choose.
The fandom-like mode of engagement that idealist politics creates highlights a fundamental flaw in the left-right dichotomy that capitalist ideology helps maintain. The point of fandom, as demonstrated by marketing strategies and consumer behavior studies, is to create and manage demand for a consumer product by cultivating a sense of community and identity around it. At its most obvious, this is often an intellectual property like Star Wars or Marvel, but there is more direct brand fandom like with Keurig coffee makers. It is instilled in the fandom that they should perform actions that demonstrate demand.
I want Szechuan sauce. Where's my Szechuan sauce? I'm Pickle Rick! My beloved dog!
Because they've been told that supply is driven by demand. And it isn't.
What the heck?
Wat kept Produktion into homo oles tu proportions? It was demand that domin at supply that preceded it. Production followed close on the heels of consumption, but it was possible only at a time when the means of production were limited, being the movement of exchange took place within very restricted bounds. With the birth of large-scale industry, this true proportion had to come to an end. Large-scale industry, forced by the very instruments at its disposal to produce on an ever-increasing scale, can no longer wait for demand. Production precedes consumption. Supply pays demand.
The way this works, companies come up with products and manufacture them, and, well, they don't just hope for the best. They also attempt to manufacture demand. That's what we call marketing. Fandom is a form of marketing in which a consumer demographic is both created and maintained. This is accomplished on both the individual and group levels. For individuals, identity is cultivated around a commodity and a place for them to belong. The community is created to house them and other people with the same cultivated identities. Not literally, of course. It would not be very cost effective to buy someone a house to get them to see a Marvel movie. But this is a group that's heavily propagandized that the feelings of incompleteness inherent in capitalism, be it alienation, the God hole, whatever, can be filled by a product the property owners sell.
A fan. The dictionary definition of the word is an enthusiast, a fervent devotee, an abbreviation of fanatic. What comes across to an outsider as a dangerous obsession or even madness is something entirely different from the point of view of the fan herself. To be a fan is a joyous existence, one filled with the happiness that stems from knowing with utter clarity the purpose of your life.
And if it sometimes feels like left versus right is the same thing as Star Wars versus Star Trek or Marvel versus DC, it's because it is. It's manufacturing and management of consumer demographics, which starts to explain why no one is getting anywhere, doesn't it?
The spectacle of modern politics, with its ideological and abstract emphasis, obscures the basis of these ideologies. To understand what the left-right dichotomy is actually accomplishing, we need to again examine the historical origins of the divide, but this time without accepting its idealist frame. The French Revolution was a time when the very fabric of society was being torn apart and rewoven, and it was when the terms left and right first took on their political meanings.
Though Norberto Bobbio acknowledges the French Revolution's association in his book, he fails to treat it as a material basis for this dichotomy's existence, and that's exactly what it is.
In the National Assembly, the legislative body that existed as the revolution took place, those who supported the monarchy and the old aristocratic order sat on the right side of the president's chair. Yes, they were averse to change and wanted to conserve the status quo, but their quintessential purpose was to preserve the rule of the class they represented. On the left side of the National Assembly sat representatives of the revolutionaries, the radicals who championed the cause of the bourgeoisie, the French word for the emerging class of capitalists. Yes, they did advocate for change, for the overthrowing of the monarchy and the establishment of a more egalitarian society than feudalism, but the origin of the left-right divide is the physical separation of representatives who supported the bourgeoisie from those who supported the aristocracy in the legislative assembly. This wasn't just symbolic. Again, this was a division based on the material interests of different classes. The bourgeoisie did embody progress from feudalism, so the left, their representatives, did speak for progress.
Better than dirt. Well, most kinds of dirt. I mean, not that fancy store-bought dirt. That stuff's loaded with nutrients. I can't compete with that stuff.
However, again, their quintessential purpose was to further the interests of the class they represented. When they advocated for a society based on merit, individual rights, and equal opportunities, being human, they meant it relatively. The bourgeoisie's interests were egalitarian relative to the feudal aristocracy.
Now, the mainstream view associates left and right with ideals inherited from this class conflict. As the rule of the bourgeoisie was established and normalized, however, those ideals proved to be flexible.
In his essay, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Karl Marx discusses how the bourgeoisie, initially advocating for equality and other revolutionary ideals, eventually revealed their true endeavor: class rule. He highlights the contradictions and the eventual consolidation of power by the bourgeoisie, which suppressed the proletariat and any other straggler classes.
The Constitution, the National Assembly, the Dynastic Parties, the Blue Entrade Republicans, the Thunder form the platform, the shade lightning of the daily press, the entire literature, the political names and the intellectual and reputations, the civil and the penal code, liberty, egalite, fraternite. I have vanished.
18th Brumaire is about how inevitable crisis drives capitalists to abandon the principles that bring them support in the first place. Calls for liberty, equality, fraternity, work well for gathering support, but these ideals contradict the material interests of class rule.
So that means the left no longer represents the bourgeoisie, right? Well, no.
As the transition to capitalism was realized, the bourgeoisie, the primary beneficiaries of this shift, asserted dominance over the aristocracy.
Now, I've always been very passionate about dominating other men. There's nothing like the feeling of another man submitting to your will. Now, that's power. Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's love. What are you talking about?
The aristocracy, once the ruling class under feudalism, found themselves in a position where they needed to adapt to the new capitalist order to maintain their influence and wealth. Capitalists represented a new form of power, distinct from the hereditary conquest of the aristocracy. As the capitalist system expanded, the savvy among the aristocracy, recognizing the shift, started to invest.
Would you like a spot of tea?
Yes!
Aristocrats who were successful in navigating the transition to capitalism were able to maintain or even enhance their social status by becoming part of the new capitalist elite. This converging of interests and integration of the aristocracy into the capitalist class led to the formation of a unified ruling class primarily defined by its control over capital.
What was once two completely different classes became sides of one. Left and right no longer had a material distinction, meaning they no longer represented distinct relationships to the means of production. The aristocracy's land-based wealth just became one form of capital. However, these categories persisted as ideas.
Rather than representing the aristocracy as a materially distinct class, the right came to represent what we might call aristocratic values, like upholding the status quo and protecting the wealth and power accumulated over generations. Thus, the right increasingly became the domain of old money. Initially representing the revolutionary aspirations of the bourgeoisie, the left's association with progress was maintained through an era of innovation. During this period, new ideas and inventions propelled individuals into wealth and facilitated new social relations. This dynamic ultimately forged a link between progress and new money, the left. While they have different values and positions, both factions share a very obvious common class interest: to sustain the capitalist system.
So Horseshoe Theory, and giddy up.
The more conservative types tend to be very skeptical of big government, and the leftist types tend to be more skeptical of big corporations. And I've always seen a commonality in those two, in that both of them are skeptical of gigantism, the emergence of giants.
On March 21st, 2024, streamer Stephen Bunnell, more commonly known as Destiny, joined Dr. Jordan B. Peterson on his podcast to discuss, among other things, the political distinction between left and right.
I enjoyed this conversation quite a bit, despite having very little in common with either of these guys. In fact, Destiny hates me. Here's him on stage saying so.
In the United States of America, we don't inherently trust any institution. This is why our entire
Why defend them then?
This is... Okay. I hate this guy, okay?
I included that so you are aware of that it's not insignificant for me to say I think this was a good conversation.
Now, this is certainly not because I completely agree with Peterson or Destiny. In fact, I very much disagree with both of them. It's just that I can't help but appreciate that these guys genuinely did try to drill down this dichotomy. In fact, after Peterson opened on the idea that conservatives are skeptical of the state while progressives are skeptical of corporations, Destiny even challenged this dichotomy.
I think today the divide we're starting to see more and more is more of like a populist, anti-populist rise, or even like an institutional or anti-institutional rise. So for instance, I think conservatives today in the United States are largely characterized with, I would say with populism, in that they're supporting like certain figures, namely right now Donald Trump, who they think alone can kind of like lead them against the corrupt institutions, be them corporate or government. I feel like most conservatives today are not as trustful of big corporations as they were back in like the Bush era, where we would, conservatives would champion, big corporations.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing because it makes the modern conservatives a lot more like the 60s leftists.
Potentially, yeah.
I mean, that brings us into the issue, too, of whether the left-right divide is actually a reasonable way of construing the current political landscape at all, and I'm not sure it is.
So you have to be able to tell why I like this conversation by now, right? Destiny's populism versus institutions dichotomy is, I think, a significantly closer assessment to the two sides than left versus right, and institutions versus anti-institutions is almost class politics, and it's even productive. It got Peterson to say he's not so sure that the left and right is a reasonable dichotomy anymore. So as they continue, Destiny acknowledges that the left-right divide still exists to some extent, but only because of Trump's populist influence on conservative politics.
Right now it kind of is, but only because so many conservatives are following Trump. So like your populist, anti-populist thing kind of maps on kind of cleanly to the left and right.
While this initially sounds like he's rebutting Peterson's idea that the dichotomy is no longer rational, Destiny immediately makes an exception.
It doesn't work with progressives, though, or the far left, because they're also anti-large everything.
We urgently need to shift to a post-growth, post-capitalist economy.
So in a surprising way, on very, very far left people, you might find them having a bit more in common with kind of like a MAGA Trump supporter.
Big government, the big tech giants, it's big government at its absolute worst.
So for instance, like both of these groups of people on the very far left will be very dovish on foreign policy. They might think that there's a lot of institutional capture of both government and corporations. So both all of the MAGA supporters and the far, far left might think that corporations don't have our best interest at heart and the government is corrupt and captured by lobbyists. Yeah, you'll see a lot of overlap there.
Right.
Look at these guys bonding over gigantism. The only way this could be any better is if they were stuffing their faces with hot wings of progressively hotter sauces.
Hey, look at us. Look at us. Huh? Who would have thought? Not me.
Anyway, when you start drilling this down, there's really only one way for it to ever actually go, right? We got to talk about Nazis. So Peterson takes this opportunity to say something any normal person would probably consider insane. But don't worry, he does go somewhere super interesting with it.
Well, I also think it's an open question still to what degree Hitler's policies were right-wing versus left-wing, and no one's done the analysis properly yet to determine that.
Well, what do we
because
consider?
It was a national socialist movement for a reason, and the socialist part of it wasn't accidental.
Well, but there was no, cooperatively formed businesses that were owned by all of the people for the people and distributed to the people. And I don't think redistribution was high on Hitler's list of things to do.
That's true. It was a strange mix of totalitarian policy.
I don't think it was a strange mix. I think it was a bid to appeal to mid-left and center-left, the KPD and the German Socialist Party by calling themselves National Socialists. I think it was very much like an authoritarian, ultra-nationalist regime.
See what I mean? I think Destiny gave a form of the most common answer you would get to that. You say Nazi, everyone who isn't a right-wing influencer says right-wing. And Peterson is indeed a right-wing influencer. But again, it gets really interesting here. Peterson does something I haven't seen even a single one of his peers do. He proposes a legitimately good idea for a randomized study.
Well, one of the things I would have done if I would have been able to hang on to my professorship at the University of Toronto would have been to extract out a random sample of Nazi policies and strip them of markers of their origin and present them to a set of people with conservative or leftist beliefs and see who agreed with them more. And that analysis has never been done as far as I know, so we actually don't know, and we could know.
You have no idea how much I would want that study to happen. In fact, I probably want it more than Peterson does. It would be one of the most interesting things ever. So, do you think it'd go how Peterson thinks it would go?
One could certainly argue that the Nazis did have some policies either side would agree with if removed from the Nazi context. For the left, there were aspects of economic stabilization after a period of hyperinflation, social welfare, contextually exclusive, of course, and community solidarity, which sounds way less horrible when you don't mention Nazis. For the right, there were themes of national prosperity, cultural identity, and individual responsibility. But once you start really concentrating on these ideas completely outside of the Nazi context, you can really start to see how the left-right dichotomy doesn't hold up. Stabilizing the economy through deep excavation of the fundamentals is something we could associate with Karl Marx, and something the right always says it wants to do. In fact, both the left and right want to do it by destroying some aspect of the productive forces. For the left, it's energy production, and for the right, it's an existential fear of all progress. Cultural identity, which we could probably call the most right-wing aspect of the Nazis, is something right-wingers wouldn't even say anymore. In fact, it's the left that's constantly talking about it. If I had $1 for every leftist who thinks land should be owned based on someone's race, I would have a lot of money.
That is to say, I think Peterson thinks this study would be a big gotcha for the left, and to some extent, I do agree, but I think it would be as much of a gotcha for the right. You see, I'm willing to bet that at least some of Nazi Germany's ideas, separated from all context and framed a certain way, would get agreement from people all over the political spectrum. What I mean is I think it would be a gotcha for all strictly partisan concerns. To really drive that home, Peterson's state equals left, corporation equals right dichotomy just can't be applied to Nazi Germany. The Third Reich amalgamated a more nasty version of what we might call a public-private partnership nowadays. And that leads us to what is perhaps Destiny's best point.
This is something I feel like I've discovered. People have no principles. I think that people are largely guided by whatever is kind of satisfying them or making them feel good at the time. I think that's a really important thing to understand because people's beliefs will seem to change at random. If you're trying to imagine that a belief is coming from some underlying principle or is governed by some internal, like moral or reasonable code or whatever.
What Destiny is hitting on here is materialism versus idealism. Materialism suggests that our material conditions, our physical and economic environment, shape our beliefs, actions, and most importantly, society. Idealism is the other way around. It's the belief that we are not, in fact, learning and reacting to an amazing universe that we are a part of, and the physical universe is what we make of it. An idea without a material basis, however, doesn't exist. Even the most irrational, strange ideas come from something that someone experienced. And that's not bad at all, despite Destiny's negative and cynical framing of it. People have no moral frameworks or principles, I think, is the wrong way to say it, but it doesn't change the fact that what he's saying here is correct.
Material conditions and interests, rather than abstract principles, are the primary drivers of human behavior and particularly social change.
The socioeconomic disparities are a lot, and class resentment is what is driving many of these anti-establishment, which are Trump voters or anti-establishment voters.
In stressing the fluidity of political beliefs in response to material circumstances, even Destiny, a man happy to repeat State Department propaganda, intuitively aligns with a materialist understanding of history.
Once we really grasp materialism and idealism dichotomy, the left-right one seems kind of ridiculous. Basically, anyone can believe anything while wanting the state and or corporations to side with them. That's really all it is. Big government is only a problem if it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and big corporations are only a problem if they're making the wrong content. And if a corporation has nothing to do with content, then it straightforwardly doesn't matter until someone makes content about it. So, horseshoe theory is right if we take the left and right, what the horseshoe signifies, as a representation of the bourgeoisie, the class of progress that absorbed the aristocracy. The left and right are two parts of one thing. Every point on the horseshoe represents some level of support, intentional or not, for capitalists and or their state.
If there are two wings, a left and a right, what are they wings of? Wings of a bird, a bald eagle, a side or outlying region or district, a part or feature of a building, usually projecting from and subordinate to the main or central part? The political spectrum is often depicted as a straight line with the left and right at opposite ends. Even if we don't bend the line into a horseshoe, it's one line. One thing. A person can claim to be radical left or right, not a Democrat or a Republican, but every 4 years, something happens.
Vote right, vote left, whatever, who gives a shit? As long as you vote for one. That's what matters, gotta get one in. Yeah, gotta see it through. Hey, Democrat or Republican, either one will do. Gotta choose, one will win, one will lose, but someone else it can't be. It's gotta be an R or a D. Stand tall, stand proud in this land of ever liberty. There's only two parties to choose in our very real democracy. Don't vote for someone else. You're a little pansy if you do.
Most political communities and organizations, whether reformist or radical, do everything possible to funnel Americans into supporting one of the two main parties' candidates for President of the United States.
Vote or die, motherfucker, motherfucker, vote or die.
Rock the vote or else I'm gonna stick a knife through your eye.
Democracy is founded on one simple rule.
Get out there and vote or I will motherfucking kill you. I like it when you vote, bitch. Shake them titties when you vote, bitch.
This is true of a wide spectrum of entities, from nonprofits like Richard Spencer's National Policy Institute to the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, from factions like the alt-right to BreadTube, from the Libertarian Party to CPUSA, the Communist Party founded over 100 years ago.
But despite the differences between aesthetics and approach, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who both served one term as president, have shown more continuity than change. And it's because they're just mascots.
Attention students, we have tallied your mascot nomination sheets, and there will now be a school-wide vote between the top two nominations. So here's the first most requested candidate, a giant douche. Y'all ready for this?
Go giant douche!
Hey, South Park, have we got school spirit? And now your second nominee, Turd Sandwich.
Who let the dog out? Turd Sandwich! Giant douche duck!
Students can now cast their choice between the giant douche and the Turd Sandwich. We'll count up the votes on Tuesday.
Both administrations' treatment of immigrants and use of detention facilities exemplifies their similarity. Biden's administration has continued policies established during the Obama era and maintained by Trump. Yeah, the kids in cages at the border problem has persisted through the last 3 administrations. Both Trump and Biden have used reforms to create the appearance of change as well. Trump, for instance, passed criminal justice reform with the First Step Act, which reduced mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses, expanded early release programs, and improved conditions in federal prisons. However, he failed to address the underlying profit motive that contributes to many systemic issues in the criminal justice system. A profit motive in prisons incentivizes higher incarceration rates, changing the purpose of the system from rehabilitation and public safety to revenue generation. Further, inmates in private prisons cost taxpayers more rather than less for many reasons, one being they keep inmates, on average, at least 3 months longer. Biden, not wanting Trump to beat him on what would otherwise be considered a leftist move, issued an executive order to phase out for-profit federal prisons. While 13 private federal prisons were initially closed, a precedent was established that allowed their continued operation through a waiver system, transforming a supposed private prison ban into a situation where for-profit prisons just need to ask the Biden administration for permission.
Well, I can't imagine that creating issues. To the capitalist on private prison boards, the phrase "private prisons are banned unless my administration grants a waiver" is likely pretty indistinguishable from "make financial contributions to my party and/or campaign." Also, the real issue isn't really with federal private prisons. The closures barely made a dent, addressing less than 8% of the overall private prison problem. The significant concern lies with state private prisons, which remain entirely unaddressed. And Kamala Harris isn't going to be any better or even different. She might look and sound different, but she's ultimately, like Biden, just an avatar for her party. Again, just a mascot.
The rhetoric and actions of both Trump and Biden highlight a theme we've been hitting since mentioning Marx's 18th Brumaire essay: the ability to claim a desire for change while ultimately maintaining class rule. The focus on public statements and promises overshadows Trump and Biden's actual impact, allowing the underlying issues to persist unaddressed. Whether we visualize the political spectrum as a straight line or a horseshoe, the key takeaway is that it's all part of a singular structure.
Part of it!
The left and right, though they appear to be ideologically opposed, both emerge from a context deeply rooted in the same class interests.
But why bend that line into a horseshoe? Why does either side start looking more fascist as it gets more extreme? Well, capitalism's crises necessitate it as they intensify. Some might want to burn society down and start over, but they usually forget that includes them, who they're part of society. They have their own lives and communities as well. Then they remember and go, oh shit, we really need to impose some kind of order that protects me and all I hold dear, but destroys everything else. Like, something's gotta get destroyed, but what gets them to that point?
The primary crisis we'll address is what Marx called the crisis of overproduction. Now, one might hear the term overproduction and conclude we're making too much stuff, but that's not what Marx was talking about. Marx was referring to a value crisis. Machines and technology are taking over jobs, making things cheaper to produce. But as things get cheaper, companies have to make and sell more of them to maintain profits. At the same time, workers are losing their jobs to machines and have less money to spend.
So there's more stuff being made and fewer people who can afford it. Sound familiar?
The government is hiding billions of pounds of cheese in hidden caves underneath the United States that it is selling off by manipulating our advertising and education systems to our detriment in order to turn a profit.
In his 1934 book Fascism and Social Revolution, R. Palm Dutt explains that capital attempts to mitigate these problems by scaling back the productive forces. This is an attempt to stabilize prices and protect profits by creating scarcity, and it comes at the expense of human life in one way or another. On the left, this can be seen in the ideology of degrowth. Despite claims of seeking transition to a post-capitalist society, often as a result of environmental concerns,
we urgently need to shift to a post-growth, post-capitalist economy.
Degrowth's prescriptions are exactly what Dutt described, responding to capitalist crises by advocating to shrink the productive forces, which may neglect to consider that this would ultimately shrink the population one way or another. Most of the left, particularly the factions that profess anti-capitalism, subscribe to some form of degrowth ideology nowadays. On the right, a similar response to capitalist crises can be seen in the rise of protectionist policies with the restriction of trade. As economic instability grows, right-wing ideologies often turn to isolationism, a focus on the interests of the national bourgeoisie, and begin rejecting any form of global cooperation. This is a form of retrenchment, a way to protect domestic capital by closing off borders and limiting external influences. The right has its own form of degrowth too, called localism. They don't claim anti-capitalism though, instead they just scaremonger about technology and outsiders, often leading to support for militarism.
So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. shrinking the productive forces would lead to internal collapse as the availability of goods and services shrinks, while isolationism presents a combative face to the world that breeds resentment. And if history has taught us anything, it's that either of these two paths leads to war, which is actually humanity's most efficient form of degrowth.
Contradictions like the aforementioned value crisis prevent capitalism from reaching and maintaining equilibrium. As these contradictions heighten, the abundance of socialized production produces scarcity for most, and homicidal, genocidal, or suicidal ideology begins to rise. If we assume capitalism must be preserved, the left's degrowth and the right's protectionist isolationism and hawkishness all make sense as idealist reactions to its underlying crises. As these ideologies become more extreme, they reveal the system's desperation to find solutions within its own confines. This is why bending the line into a horseshoe makes sense. It shows how the extremes, in their attempts to address capitalism's crises, converge in their effects, even if not in their intentions.
As partisans move further from the center, their tactics and narratives are characterized as more radical or extreme. But what people mean when they say those words is more detached from reality and less tolerant of dissent. These supposedly opposite sides begin to mirror each other in their fervor and willingness to do whatever it takes to advance their cause, and their cause is materially derived from the ruling class. And I know someone out there's got to be thinking it, but didn't the left shift to represent the proletariat? Why do you think that? Is it because leftist movements often claim to represent the proletariat? Well, how's that been going?
Again, the left and right political paradigm originated from a physical manifestation of the class divide in the French National Assembly. The bourgeoisie's representation sat on the left of the room, while representation for their opposing class, the aristocracy, sat on the right. Actual, physical embodiment of class divide. Despite the rise in movements claiming to fight for the working class, there's little evidence that movements simply termed leftist have represented the proletariat's interests on any kind of exclusive basis.
This is a local community, and we're all in the same boat. Go outside BP, go outside Shell, go and do this somewhere useful.
Instead, many leftist movements have mirrored the bourgeoisie's original tactics, professing certain values and immediately abandoning them when they gain support.
Everybody in, nobody out. A single-payer healthcare plan, universal healthcare plan. That's what I'd like to see.
You've got to take a responsibility to get health insurance. We're not going to have other people carrying your burdens for you.
In 2014, an individual mandate which required Americans to pay a penalty if they decided not to buy a health insurance plan went into effect.
This pattern suggests that these movements, despite their rhetoric, are not materially rooted in the proletariat's interests.
The left and right represent two philosophical tendencies of bourgeois class politics. The thing the left and right can be relied on most to do is elect Democrats and Republicans, either happily or reluctantly.
If I have to crawl off the goddamn floor on the morning of November 4th, brush aside the empty wine bottles, and pick up my phone to discover that Caligula Jackson is president for life, I am going to chew my way through the bathroom tile, and I will not stop until I reach the gates of hell. Typical T-thought normie Radlib endorses the electoral farce. Is this your leftist queen of YouTube? Looks more like a rich Karen who'd rather complain about cancel culture than revolt against the neoliberal status quo. So I really do understand the perspective that Biden is not worth voting for, because that was also my first reflex when he was nominated. But on reflection, I think to throw away this vote would be a terrible mistake. Don't make me eat my bathroom tile, children. There's probably asbestos in that tile, because America's so great even the floor is made of poison.
But Donald Trump isn't a fascist, at least not any more than any other Western politician is. And more importantly, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not communists.
What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse. Mine would strengthen the economy.
They're all just mascots.
Sir, some students and parents are reluctant to have a giant douche represent them. What do you say to those people? Look at my opponent. He is a turd sandwich.
You're a turd sandwich.
No, sir, if you'll pardon me, you are in fact the turd sandwich.
You're a turd sandwich.
Sir, you are a turd sandwich.
You're a turd sandwich.
What a douche.
My name is Aaron Bushnell. I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal.
On February 25, 2024, Aaron Bushnell tragically passed away after setting himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., an act intended to protest the ongoing U.S.-backed injustices and acts of violence against the Palestinian people. Bushnell was 25 years old, emblematic of the post-Generation X struggle, confronting problems like higher debt, decreasing wages when adjusted for inflation, and an overwhelming sense of alienation and political disenfranchisement.
And it makes sense. Like, what are we supposed to do? We don't have a path within this system. Voting doesn't change the fact Israel is a client state of U.S. imperialism, operating under the blessing of our state, no matter how much a politician of ours might say their methods are extreme. Our state keeps sending them billions of dollars either way. We've watched the left and right win and lose for decades, and we're more or less on the same path we've always been on. With no outlet, no plan, no path, what do you think people are gonna do? And history repeats with diminishing returns. First is tragedy, then is farce.
Maxwell Azzarello, at 37, shared the same post-Generation X hardships as Bushnell. Azzarello lit himself on fire outside the New York trial of former President Donald Trump. But he offered a little more insight than Bushnell, posting an explanation. Azzarello was a registered Democrat who voted for Bernie Sanders, and the 2016 and 2020 DNC primaries, specifically the latter in which the entire race was rearranged to prevent even a slightly less mainstream politician from nomination, were more than enough to disillusion him.
As it turns out, we have a secret kleptocracy. Both parties are run by financial criminals whose only goals are to divide, deceive, and bleed us dry. They divide the public against itself and blame the other party while everything gets worse, more expensive, and a handful of people take all the money. Since it is fully parasitic, a secret kleptocracy is an incredibly unstable form of government. Left to its own devices, it can only lead to fascism or a failed state.
Azzarello was born in 1987, Reagan's America. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the bipolar world, was imminent. And when it happened, liberal democracy and free markets were proclaimed the winner. If, as Marx said, the history of all hitherto existing human society is the history of class struggles, this was the end of history, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government, as Francis Fukuyama put it.
The biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War. Communism died this year.
Indeed, there has been very little history in this era. The fall of the Soviet Union and the unchallenged rise of neoliberalism meant that while some aspects of life improved through technological innovation and globalization, these things didn't work out to be necessarily good as systemic inequalities deepened. Political cycles alternated between left and right, one side always the underdog, identifying the flaws of the incumbent, yet neither managing to implement real changes. This cycle of promises and failures has led to a pervasive disillusionment, especially among younger generations who have grown up under its shadow. To many, today's political framework feels more like a relic than a roadmap, and yet it is upheld at all costs. In this context, Bushnell and Azzarello, both leftists who'd seen inaction for too long, are people who truly want the world to be a better place, but sadly, they believed that the most they were capable of was self-destruction. Their extreme actions are what makes them notable, but they aren't anomalies. Many desire to break out of the paralysis and change things. These incidents aren't just random outbursts. They're serious cries of anguish that our system is built to ignore.
Consider America since 1988. Institutions like healthcare and universities have become parasitic in their skyrocketing prices. News media tells us to be angry and tribalized. Daytime television warns us of moral decay. Local news tells us to fear our neighbors. Reality TV tells us that real life is filled with hedonism and strife. This is our rotten farce. For our entire lives, we have been flooded with media, designed to slowly steer us into a world where the American dream was dead, where the public was fully divided against itself, where everybody believed we were powerless to do anything about our worsening circumstances. It is all so they can organize an unprecedented, apocalyptic rug pull on the entire populace as they pivot to fascism, which is perhaps best understood as kleptocracy at the barrel of a gun. When we piece it all together, we understand the truth. We are in a totalitarian doomsday cult.
What Francis Fukuyama called the end of history brought about a worldview that Marxist theorist Mark Fisher called capitalist realism in his 2009 book of the same name. Capitalist realism is, boiled down, the idea that capitalism is the only feasible economic system, the only system truly compatible with human nature. In the book, Fisher discussed the very anguish that Bushnell and Azzarello likely felt and contended that it won't be understood or fixed if seen as just a series of individual troubles affecting flawed people. Instead, Fisher asserted that the struggle is deeply intertwined with the institutional systems in which we all live. Support or therapy can certainly improve an individual's or even a small group's problems, but they can't change the environment in which good people who want the world to be a better place can only run up against dead ends.
Mark Fisher also ended his own life, but he didn't light himself on fire, nor was his death a protest of any kind. He hung himself. Neither he, Maxwell Azzarello, or Aaron Bushnell needed to die. I think their dire measures should be seen as manifestations of leftist ideology's inherent failure to address the growing problems of a system that can't help but cycle through crisis after crisis. Its contradictions can only ever be resolved if consciousness of the material interests behind them, who rules versus who serves, is what's compelling the action. And there hasn't been a material basis for the left as a side in this struggle since the French Revolution. It's just vague ideals no one can really agree on.
For one point of clarification, when you say leftist, what do you mean by that?
Well, the central problem being one of relative inequality in distribution of resources, and the central solution to that being something like state-sponsored economic intervention.
Gotcha. Okay. I only want to be clear on that because people get mad if I call myself a leftist. Oftentimes online or especially in Europe or worldwide, leftists will refer exclusively to like socialists or communists. And anybody to the right of that would be considered like a liberal. If you
No,
like
usually a fascist.
Well, depending on
very rapidly.
Yeah.
Nearly a century before the end of history, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, Russian society was rife with widespread discontent with the Tsarist regime, deep inequalities, and eventually the hardships of the First World War. Russia had been transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, and the Bolsheviks, a faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party that won majority support in 1903, seized on the uncertainty to lead one of the most significant revolutions in history. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, advocated for a radical restructuring of society through policies that nationalized industry and collectivized agriculture, and, in many respects, they succeeded. However, in the aftermath of the 1917 revolution and the early years of the Soviet Union, the communist movement faced internal and external challenges. In this context, Lenin observed tendencies within the left that he deemed problematic. Lenin's critique, outlined in his 1920 work, The Infantile Sickness of Leftism and Communism, was directed at a faction within the communist movement that he believed was adopting an overly purist and dogmatic approach.
We must see to it that a mistake made by the left communists is corrected as soon as possible and eliminated as rapidly and painlessly as possible. It is not only right doctrinarism that is erroneous, left doctrinarism is erroneous too. Right doctrinarism persisted in recognizing only the old forms and became utterly bankrupt, for it did not notice the new content. Left doctrinarism persists in the unconditional repudiation of certain old forms, failing to see that the new content is forcing its way through all and sundry forms, that it is our duty as communists to master all forms, to learn how, with the maximum rapidity, to supplement one form with another, to substitute one for another, and to adapt our tactics to any such change that does not come from our class or from our efforts.
Lenin's critique of left-wing communism was very insightful, and he correctly identified the dogmatic, uncompromising, and impractical nature of the so-called revolutionary left. That said, his critique focused more on this ideological conceit rather than addressing the material origins of the left. This work is still incredibly useful because it provides tactical reference for what does not work, but at no point does he truly reckon with what the left materially means. Generally, the left professes to be the real advocates for the ideals the bourgeoisie once used to gain popularity, liberty, equality, community, but promptly abandon when their class rule is threatened. In these ideals, however, the left can't seem to bring itself to threaten the bourgeoisie's class rule. Not only are they simply claiming to be the true bringers of the same ideals, even if they weren't, ideals don't drive history. People's material interests do.
Leftists refuse to interrogate the left. To them, something unpleasant lurks deep within the depths, hiding beneath the facade, a papered-over fracture that no one dares tamper with from the fear that addressing it will open a vast crevasse. Its protectors are draped in the banners of bygone eras who chant the old anthems to drown out the sound of the cracking. And we wonder why they end up dead or voting for Democrats.
How can black people rise up and overcome?
Get out and vote?
That is incorrect.
In the years following the USSR's rise and Lenin's death in 1924, the global landscape was ripe for ideological warfare. The spread of communism was viewed as a threat to Western democracies, leading to the era commonly referred to as the Red Scare. This period saw an intense focus on anti-communist sentiment, and at this time, communism was painted as destructive, violent, and oppressive. This demonization of communism aimed to contain and diminish Soviet influence worldwide. The portrayal of communism as sinister was also used to justify U.S. interventions in foreign nations under the guise of protecting them from communism.
It's actually been an open secret for decades, but for the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. Well, the U.S. was concerned at the time that that would mean a victory for the Soviets in the Cold War.
There were over 9 coups, somewhere between 9 and 100 coups between the 50s and 70s, most of which the CIA was directly involved in, which is pretty funny. Working in the shadows to remove people from power, stop the spread of communism, and just kill people, it seems like. That's what it seems like a lot of this was to do.
Intellectual and cultural campaigns were ramped up to discredit the USSR and exalt the virtues of capitalist democracy. Throughout these years of fear and ideological entrenchment, the USA and its allies went to insane ends to undermine communism's appeal.
When anybody preaches disunity, tries to pit one of us against the other through class warfare, you know that person seeks to rob us of our freedom and destroy our very lives. And we know what to do about it.
And they had to try really hard. Despite the fervent anti-communism of the time, communism found substantial support within the United States, especially during the economic turmoil of the Great Depression.
The American Communist Party of this era, CPUSA, played a significant role in organizing labor strikes, advocating for workers' rights, and helping to shape New Deal policies. The party's involvement in struggles for racial equality and labor rights added to its appeal and membership, which saw a significant increase during the 1930s. The successes and popular support for communism pressured Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration to respond to the Great Depression by adopting extensive economic reforms.
You see, the ruling class were afraid of their subjects, who were operating on a consciousness that the two parties at odds were not, in fact, the ones in Congress, but the owners and everyone else. And so they made a deal, the New Deal, and it was a deal in the traditional sense. We give you some of the stuff the communists are asking for, and in return, you don't overthrow us. Deal.
The New Deal fostered significant economic recovery and laid the foundation for decades of prosperity in the United States. Although it didn't usher in a higher stage of society, it should be regarded as a huge success for American communists, saving many lives and significantly improving people's conditions. This was only possible because, for the CPUSA of that time, the primary division was not between left and right, but between the capitalist class and the subordinate class. The party's emphasis was on uniting workers of all backgrounds to fight against the issues inherent in the capitalist system. Lenin's ideas and the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 provided a model for successful revolutionary action that CPUSA aspired to emulate in their own American context. CPUSA generally incorporated the critique found in infantile sickness and worked to maintain a more flexible and pragmatic approach. This included forming alliances with other working class movements, including labor unions led by more conservative leadership when necessary.
But like I said, the United States and its allies went to insane ends to try to undermine communism's appeal. Now, the CPUSAs of then and now are very different. Today's has been criticized for aligning with mainstream democratic policies and focusing people's energy on electoral politics. This shift is attributed to several factors, including significant infiltration by federal agencies like the FBI's Project Solo, exposed by the Freedom of Information Act, and was shown to have infiltrated very high levels of the CPUSA, like representatives to the Soviet Union and China level high levels. Then there's the whole COINTELPRO thing, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. You are gonna love that one.
The institutional response included the establishment of organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom in 1950, which presented itself as a defender of intellectual liberty and leftist ideals in the face of the evil communism. Yet, it was later uncovered that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was directly funded and influenced by the CIA, part of a broader initiative to use cultural propaganda to counteract communist influence. Today, the CIA openly brags about it on their website, saying, "The Congress for Cultural Freedom is widely considered one of the CIA's most daring and effective Cold War covert operations." The CIA also notes that the agency arranged an amicable separation from the Congress in 1966, But this was actually due to the New York Times, also a very different institution in decades past, exposing the nature of the organization in a series of expose articles that showed the CIA secretly funding false front organizations, one of which was the Congress of Cultural Freedom. According to a later New York Times article, CCF leadership had been categorically denying rumors of such a covert subsidy for years.
Now, to be completely fair, many involved claimed they didn't know where the money was coming from. Some even expressing anger that they were being used. And some of them were actually probably being used. Not all of them, but think about it this way. If I made videos that heavily reinforced state and corporate narratives, I might suddenly see a big increase on my Patreon. And I wouldn't know where it came from, just that my recent content was super well received. What I'm saying here is that you don't have to know you're an asset to be an asset. That said, the CCF's leaders at least probably did know. After the CCF was exposed, it amicably separated from the CIA, and it was renamed the International Association for Cultural Freedom and funded by, instead of the CIA, the Ford Foundation and billionaire philanthropists before merging into, yes, George Soros's Open Society Foundation in 1992, and continued using the exact same playbook to stoke the color revolutions in communist sympathetic states in the post-Soviet Eastern Bloc. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Through the CCF and similar schemes, the West sought to reshape the ideological landscape, promoting a leftism compatible with U.S. imperial interests. This ensured that even leftist movements would not align too closely with the Soviet model, thus maintaining Western ideological supremacy. And then, hippies.
So it seems like we have enough people now. When do we start taking down the corporations?
Right now, we're proving we don't need corporations. We don't need money. This can become a commune where everyone just helps each other. Yeah, we'll have one guy who makes bread, and one guy who he looks out for other people's safety.
You mean like a baker and a cop?
No, can't you imagine a place where people live together and provide services for each other in exchange for their services?
Yeah, it's called a town.
You kids just haven't been to college yet.
Most commonly associated with hippies, the New Left emerged in the 1960s, marking a significant shift from focusing on labor and class struggle to a broader spectrum of issues, including civil rights, anti-war efforts, and social reforms. The New Left's stated goals sounded good: peace, love, personal freedom. However, in its lack of focus on the defining contradictions and conflicts of capitalist society, the New Left was fundamentally compatible with capitalism, regardless of their avowed distaste for it.
One of the first questions that they'll ask is, what do you do? And so I say, I live. And they say, no, I mean, do you work or what? And I say, no, I just live. And they say, well, you must do something.
Instead of centering on the conflict between the rulers and the ruled, those with power and those without, it was believed that societal change could naturally follow from personal transformation and peaceful protest. The hippie New Left demanded that people abandon consumerism, but without a materialist critique of what consumerism is, they failed to even question its base assumptions. In fact, in their eyes, materialism just meant buying stuff and having possessions, the consumerism they insisted people leave behind. Make different choices and the world will change is a view that naively accepts the capitalist market ideology that demand still straightforwardly drives supply, despite the development of large-scale industry that creates supply first and then advertises a demand into existence. Thus, it credulously accepts the neoliberal ideology that life functions as a market, and that this outdated supply and demand idea therefore applies to one's social life. This all dovetailed considerably with the strategies of entities like the Congress for Cultural Freedom. By steering revolutionary zeal into cultural and individual battles rather than class struggle, these entities helped maintain the ideological dominance of the West by focusing on symptoms rather than the diseases that cause them.
That's what the left is: bourgeois ideological talk. When people start to stray from it and get a little too far into class struggle, the same kind of revolutionary struggle that established the concept of the American dream in the first place, the rulers figure out some way to infect them with the infantile sickness. And that's what they've been doing since then. In the latter part of the 20th century and into the world we live today, the world Aaron Bushnell and Max Azzarello grew up in, the American dream has died.
The American dream is dead.
The hippies became yuppies and transitioned into business roles. They eventually gave us the dot-com bubble, the real estate bubble, the Apple walled garden, and the 971 $5 streaming subscriptions we all have. Liberal capitalism won. History ended. And just like after the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie's promise of liberty, equality, fraternité has vanished. First as tragedy, then as farce.
America is about democracy and liberty. We choose amongst ourselves and that there's a working, fair democracy. And it's about you can say what you want. You can believe what you want. You can be who you want. You can have the identity you want. You can be anything you want. And the great American ideal is leave people the fuck alone. And the left forgot that. They don't give a fuck about freedom of speech anymore. They don't get how stupid it is to shut people up and how quickly that's going to come around and kick you in the ass. Same thing with Trump. If you just wield authority like this, say fuck democracy, no one's going to have your back. So that's, to me, the two sides have fucked up those two principles.
And that the problem is both those sides are correct to point the finger at the other side.
Yes, that's
and
why
be
it's
like, this is why we're fucked up. That's why we're fucked up.
That's
and they
why
just won't stop.
That's why it becomes a looking glass. Yes, they are right about each other.
Yeah, they're right.
They're right about each other.
We have lived through the slow decay of an unopposed imperial stage capitalism, and many have had enough. A resurgence of interest in radical politics has caused the resurrection of many communist symbols, but this resurgence has been mostly aesthetic. After decades of compatible leftism, devoid of a material focus on the defining contradictions of capitalist society, would-be revolutionaries focus more on the subversive appeal of these symbols. This can be described as, yes, but it's good, leftism. Rather than denying accusations of Red Scare radicalism, we see an ironic acceptance that repurposes the stereotypes of socialism and communism into a subversive cultural identity. A radical facade operating within safe, non-threatening parameters.
The new left crap ultimately led to what people are calling wokeness today, which is often linked with Marx, but is at most a distortion from those unfamiliar or even hostile to his work. But even without wokeness, or the new left, many treat Marx like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, leading to what I call fandom Marxism or lifestyle radicalism. This commodifies dissent, turning resistance into a brand devoid of disruption. It cultivates identity and commodifies community, and revolution becomes something one can buy, wear, watch, or post about rather than some kind of systemic change, although one might still think that's the goal. However, this brand of radicalism is safe and completely aligned with consumer capitalism. It allows one to feel revolutionary online.
Online.
Yeah.
It's a sophisticated form of control, one that presents itself as subversive but actually helps sustain the very structures of power it ostensibly opposes. And it is the inevitable, logical conclusion of a left. Any left, not a non-Marxist left, but the left. As I've said, the left isn't a material distinction. It was back when it was the bourgeoisie versus the aristocracy in the French Revolution, but today it's ideology, bourgeois ideology, capitalist propaganda.
So imagine a person who is upset with the world. They are like a modern three-pronged plug designed for an outlet without a ground wire. Now, picture capitalism as an old-fashioned two-pronged outlet. If you try to plug it in, it's physically impossible. Leftist issues with capitalism seem completely incompatible. So when I say leftism supports capitalism, leftists retort, but I'm a three-pronged plug and capitalism is a two-pronged outlet. I can't plug into capitalism. Idiot. Idiot! But the problem is, these exist. This is ideology. This seemingly incompatible plug can be adapted to work with the old outlet. The ground wire is just rerouted to the neutral, just like the left's disdain for capitalism is rerouted to support it. Leftism becomes the adapter, making it compatible to the system it claims to oppose. But in practice, what does that look like?
On May 24th, 2024, a YouTube channel called In Praise of Shadows uploaded a 3-hour and 20-minute video entitled Bad Conservative Horror Movies. For the first 58 minutes of the video, the host, Zane, complains about two things. The first is a horror convention called Mad Monster, which Zane attended because Kevin Spacey was a guest and he had a problem with that. Zane criticizes the event harshly, highlighting the lack of shuttle service from the overflow parking, paper wristbands, the lack of available food until he realized they had it the next day, he just didn't find it, panels lacking famous guests, and issues with the pool at his hotel, which was unrelated to Mad Monster in any way. He uses these complaints to attack another YouTuber, whom he deems conservative for being centrist, enjoying the convention, and not criticizing the event for having Kevin Spacey. Second, Zane complains about the response to a video he made a few years ago where he argued that the cannibals in The Hills Have Eyes represent marginalized groups oppressed by American imperialism. He says conservatives were particularly harsh in their reactions and laments not making enough money on YouTube anymore.
That video is an hour and 25 minutes. Reducing what I was trying to get across down to a single one-sentence tweet, of course, is going to make me look like an insane person.
Okay, sure, that's true. So backlash in his comments has created a preconceived notion about him, limiting his success as a creator. This happens, believe me. I know. But he's upset because he made a 1 hour and 20-minute video claiming the cannibals in The Hills Have Eyes represent Black, Indigenous, and queer people, his words, not mine, and he's surprised people reacted negatively? Honestly, I'm shocked it was the right that went after him. In this story, the violent cannibals are historically marginalized groups. It doesn't exactly come off well, even if his intent was to explain what he perceived as a metaphor rather than to call marginalized people savages, but ultimately that's exactly what he did, even if accidentally. I mean, I've said things that people misinterpret, but my response has always been to ask why. And yes, plenty of it is intentional and dishonest, but people don't always know what your intent is. I'm also not surprised people didn't exactly take to Zane. He's self-important, smug in tone, long-winded, never seems to get to the point, and I haven't even gotten to his politics. If you couldn't tell from his obsession with conservatives, he's a leftist.
After, again, 58 minutes of Zane complaining about a horror convention and his videos getting fewer views on YouTube, we're finally presented with the title card, Bad Conservative Horror Movies. He then brings up Late Night with the Devil, which he finds notable because it contains several AI-generated title cards.
Zane never directly characterizes Late Night with the Devil as conservative. Instead, he does the whole H-bomber guy, AI is unethical and anyone who uses it is a thief and literally scum bit, and characterizes AI usage as prioritizing profit and efficiency at the expense of creativity and ethical considerations, which he considers more or less conservative. He then shits out this gem.
Horror is an intrinsically left, punk, anti-establishment, countercultural art form that is primarily concerned with social issues and pushing boundaries beyond what is deemed acceptable by traditional, more conservative, polite society. There's no other way that you can rationally look at it and still exist within reality. Just about every major work of iconic horror has had a leftist message to what it is trying to say at its heart about the human condition. And the people and the tastemakers at the forefront of the genre pushing it forward from the very beginning up to modern day have always been transgressive artists, looking to express something that they otherwise couldn't in more mainstream outlets.
I am a leftist, and when I like something, it's leftist. Everything that doesn't conform to my taste and specific morals is, therefore, conservative. My taste is morally good, and their taste is morally bad. Also, the good stuff is not commercially appealing, obviously, so it can't do well. The pleb consumerists just don't understand art. They just want all the boxes ticked. Horror really is like a pheromone that attracts left narcissists who deem themselves auteurs and believe they don't need to learn or develop. No, society is just wrong about their art. That's why they never get anywhere. Not that they're making pretentious crap that is itself another form of box ticking. No, sir! Anyway, Zane's statement perfectly encapsulates the infantile sickness of leftism. We are innovative, ahead of the curve, progressive, and that is why we continually fail. It's self-important and elitist, but also jealous and subservient. Against tradition, but only insofar as to establish new standards. Zane's standards, leftist standards. You see, only leftists can produce or appreciate good art.
During this section, he makes it clear that this video isn't about bad conservative horror movies. Instead, he spends the next hour and 40 minutes talking about how apolitical movies are actually conservative. He also characterizes The Exorcist and Near Dark as conservative, but not as bad movies, oddly enough. He then spends the last 40 minutes attacking Wendigoon, the cheese cave guy from Part 2.
The government is hiding billions of pounds of cheese in hidden caves underneath the United States.
A YouTuber known primarily for his Iceberg Explained videos, which are sometimes, but not exclusively, horror adjacent. Zane's core problem with Wendigoon is that in its early days, he was associated with a libertarian group called the Boogaloo Boys, which he dissociated with when he perceived them as becoming more extreme. Wendigoon has since stated on multiple occasions that he doesn't like making political content and therefore doesn't.
Frankly, I'm not a political commentator and am terrified of being mistaken for one.
Zane then details associations between Wendigoon and other people Zane deems bad.
Wendigoon is very publicly friends with Turkey Tom. Wendigoon is publicly friends with Donut Operator. He is publicly friends with Shoe on Head. Wendigoon is publicly friends with Brandon Herrera. He has publicly interacted in a friendly way with the account Rock Solid on multiple occasions. He is friends with Oompaville. He is friends with Mutahar. He has interacted positively with Garand Thumb. Wendigoon is publicly connected to the Internet Historian, and has even appeared in his videos.
This is how leftism acts as a capitalist justifying ideology. This guy rails against consumerism, attacks big business, and even brings up fandom, stuff I constantly criticize. But leftism redirects him away from capital and back to his peers. Though leftists claim to see through capitalism's lies, they still accept its assumptions. They still think that to change supply, you change demand, meaning consuming differently and making different individual choices. So basically, never challenging the ruling class, but rather people's taste.
Oh, he's just a YouTuber. Why does it matter? Or, so what if he's a conservative? Is that a problem? Which, the answer to that is yes.
He then just spends the rest of the paper talking about leftist again. Specifically, he talks about how it is dangerous to let leftists into the movement, which Ted's certainly on an ivory horse thinking he can pick and choose revolutionaries.
But the reason that I care is because this does not belong in horror, or anywhere. I care deeply about horror, and everything that he does has demonstrated so far in his career that he should not be welcomed in our spaces, or even, just in public in general.
You may be asking about Wendigoon. Isn't this just a manifesto to explain why he wants to kill people? And yes, it's exactly that, and not much more. And ultimately, that's the biggest problem with Ted Kaczynski.
The Congress of Cultural Freedom was established to address the grievances of ideological dissent and ensure that the response concentrates on anything but capital. Leftists like Zane of In Praise of Shadows are their desired result. When there are no material distinctions, when everything is centered on professed beliefs and utopian futures, it's pretty easy to transform the concerns a leftist might have, which are mostly valid, into Zane, keeping track of things individuals have said, who they're friends with, making naughty and nice lists, policing spaces, and generally being totally unappealing.
These people can yell about hating capitalism all day. Congrats, you hate capitalism. Well, I don't hate capitalism. I'm thankful to live in it rather than feudalism. However, I think we can and will do better because that's how history works. I don't care about leftist intent, only their effect. The left exists to look progressive while preserving bourgeois class rule, intentionally or not. And it creates pretentious, annoying people like Zane, theorists who despair like Mark Fisher, and people willing to sacrifice themselves to signal rather than enact real change like Aaron Bushnell and Max Azzarello. At their core, most of these people just want a better world, but ideology leads them away from class consciousness and into individualism, various rabbit holes, and or depression. Eventually, people get so direction-brained that their real goal is to point out the bad guys, which is eventually everyone because it is a competition after all. It's fandom, consuming more and consuming right, proving you're the real fan, the best representation, the best advocate for the lifestyle, endless market segmentation, new, slightly different niches, atomizing more and more. These people don't have friends. At most, they have co-conspirators, but it is a contest. Eventually, everyone else has to be defeated. And it's tragic.
And in tragedy, we shouldn't be shocked that when someone says enough is enough, they don't mean it's time to change things, but I can't go on. Aaron Bushnell was right to stand up to U.S. imperialism. He was right to take action against horrifying measures being taken to maintain Western hegemony. But he was wrong about what action to take. Max Azzarello was right to call this society a doomsday cult. He is right that we've been flooded with media designed to slowly steer us to believe that we're powerless. But he was wrong about how to get out of it. Mark Fisher was right about the end of history and the overwhelming conditions that produced a depressed society mourning its own slow death as it attempts to pause the development of humanity to preserve class rule.
These men pursued the stated goals of leftism without interrogating them. But the fact is, when you follow the left's tactics, the goals don't matter. When change doesn't come, the problem is seen as quantitative. So the impulse is to simply be more leftist, more extreme, more radical.
Start a fucking revolution. Start a fucking revolution. Start a fucking revolution. You've got nothing to lose.
But nothing happens. With the exception of Zane, the guys I mentioned are dead. None of them should be, but direction brain can't lead anyone to progress. It leads us instead away from other people, away from community, from shared material interests, from our own humanity. To bring this home, I have to say something maybe a little controversial. The left's tactics can be compared to emotional abuse, while the right's are more akin to physical abuse. Physical abuse is completely unacceptable and immediately understood as such. But emotional abuse, like leftist ideology, can be more obstructive because it's harder to identify and escape. This isn't to say physical abuse or right-wing ideology is less dangerous. It's obviously not, but both need to be defeated. The right is unforgivably bad, but the left is the bigger obstruction. Both sides are bad. Left and right sometimes refer to ideals or, at most, factions. Sometimes it's progress versus reaction, new money versus old money, freedom versus fascism, or bankers and tech versus real estate developers. And they all completely 100% agree with each other on Horseshoe Theory. It's bullshit. Also, they agree on a lot of other things. People need to understand that these things are all aspects of one thing, the ruling class. Yeah, the left and right both hate each other, but they also both want control of the government to maintain the war in Ukraine, to keep a client state in the Middle East by funding a genocide, and to continue seeking Taiwanese separatism.
I'm a proud Democrat. But first and foremost, I'm a proud Republican and Democrat and mostly American.
A horseshoe is one thing. It's got two sides, but it's not two things. That thing is capitalism, the global order. The right is part of it, and so is the left. They become more similar as we reach the extremes. They dig in their heels and they both wear boots while high-stepping because neither is willing to be something else. The next stage of human society, whatever that looks like, is something else. I'll make you a deal, a new deal. If you try to argue about economic systems, I won't say that's not real communism. If you don't say this isn't real capitalism, they're both real. Communism has had failures and atrocities, but capitalism has too. World wars, depressions, crashes, genocides old and new, and the continuous decay of society, even when totally unopposed. That's all real capitalism, baby. But it's also not because it's evil. It's because it's the global economic system, and it contains a contradiction that makes it feed on itself. The left and right both see communism as taking things from the rich and giving to the poor. They disagree on whether or not this is a good thing, but ultimately, once direction brain sets in, it actually is about envy. Both sides would burn everything to the ground if they could take everything the other guy has, start over, and rule their way. And neither side talks about communism as a process of improving society from where it is now, but as a hypothetical outcome that is either good or bad. I don't. I'm not a leftist, and I'm not a rightist either. I'm just a bachelor looking for a partner, someone that knows how to ride without even falling off. I don't have a horse in this race. I am not interested in making anyone poor. I hope we can instead make everyone rich, which will only be possible through the building and expansion of the productive forces and vast abundance for all. I'm pretty sure that will not happen as long as bourgeois class rule is maintained. So what I'm saying doesn't land anywhere on the horseshoe. Humanity is incredible. Seriously, think about what we've done and what we're capable of doing. Yes, there is a dark aspect to that, but it only seems to come along when the contradictions heighten without resolution. When we resolve those contradictions, society moves forward. And yes, we should be free to think, free to do, free to be. Right now, due to capitalism, we are closer to that than we have ever been in human history. Capitalism is an amazing human invention that has progressed us to a point beyond any of our predecessors' dreams, whether they lived 50 million years ago or 50. But it still has that contradiction. The socialization of production with the individual/feudal mode of appropriation creates an underclass that eventually lacks enough buying power to sustain the economy, stopping growth in its tracks. There are no limits to growth except that contradiction. So, do you want to keep horsing around, or do you want to do something new? I'm Peter Coffin, and this documentary has been very important.
Generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerers of death's construction. In the fields of bodies